Many thanks, David. Now, Rory, if you would give your 5-minute rebuttal and possibly take on board David's question about 2001 in Afghanistan.
Well, it's extremely difficult debating David, given the enormous quantity of his charm. He appears to begin his entire speech with a book blurb for mine, which I've been writing down, put on the cover of my next book. It also, I felt, almost served as a kind of marriage advert. I'm extremely grateful to him. The Chicago speech, though, is a great way of looking at the differences between the two of us. Essentially, the problem about the Chicago speech of 1999 is it leads to Iraq in 2003. Not perhaps necessarily, not perhaps in terms of some ineluctable philosophical process, but because of the kind of instincts and intuitions which Blair and I think David share. And I'm just going to run quickly through what David just said in order to talk about what I see the problem as being, because these problems are sometimes quite elusive. The reason the Chicago speech was so successful is it appeals to so many of our instincts and moral intuitions. So the first one, you remember, David began by saying, Blair sees the world as being interdependent, right? Nothing too wrong with that, you would have thought. In fact, it ties in with the whole notion of the world as a global village. You begin to think about Friedman's books. In fact, it ties in with many of our assumptions about the direction in which global culture is going. He says we may be morally bound to intervene. Well, that also seems intuitively right. I mean, indeed, as David says, I don't think there's anyone in this room who wouldn't feel that we had both a moral right and an obligation to intervene in the case of the Holocaust. He says that if these countries tip towards democracy, it's broadly speaking good for them and good for us, and if they tip to dictatorship, broadly speaking bad for them and bad for us. He says that non-intervention holds dangers, that our international institutions are imperfect, the United Nations, for example, Gaddafi being on the Human Rights Council. And then he sets these various conditions. This is the 7th and final point. We have to be sure of the case, exhausted the diplomatic options. We need to be sensible. We need to be prudent. We need to think about the long term. But if you push into every one of those 7 points, and obviously within 5 minutes I don't have the time to push in those 7 points, you see the same problem again and again, which is a lack of understanding of the difficulty of the world and a lack of understanding of our own paranoia and megalomania. Right? The problem with the question of moral obligation, to take the second point, is yes, indeed, we may be morally bound. We may well have a moral obligation. But what are the limits of that obligation? Ought implies can. You do not have a moral obligation to do what you cannot do. It's all very well patting ourselves on the back and saying we have a moral obligation towards the people of Afghanistan or Iraq. But what are its limits? What kind of obligation? How many troops are you prepared to sacrifice? How much money are you prepared to spend? What kind of obligation is this? Is this like the obligation to your own people? And what can you do? It's true the world is interdependent, but that too carries with it its own dangers. The notion that the world is interdependent was exactly the kind of fears that drove and continue to drive this morass in Afghanistan. It's that fear that if Afghanistan falls, Pakistan will fall, the region will crumble. It's the kind of fears that we used to call the domino theory. And as for the rest of this, yes, it's true that Blair says we have to be prudent and we have to think about the long term and we have to consider our exit strategy. But what he fails to take into account are the nature of our own institutions. We are a very optimistic culture, but our military, above all, in its DNA, is optimistic. There is no soldier who says, or who we would ever want to say, this mission is impossible. We are defeated. Every general, given a chance, will say, okay, I've come up with a new strategy, give me some more resources, and I'm going to crack this one. You cannot, as we found over the last 10 years, simply rely, as Blair thought he could, on going in to see the chiefs of staff and saying, is this Iraq thing doable? Is this Afghan thing doable? Because the answer always comes back, as it's coming from Petraeus at this very moment, yes, it is. I'm cautiously optimistic. Every general says, I've inherited a dismal situation, but I have a new strategy requiring new resources, and this year will be the decisive year. What does this all mean? Well, this all means that if you understand that connection between the energies, the confidence, the optimism, and the fears that drove the Blair of the Chicago speech in 1999 to the Iraq of 2003, you see where the problem in intervention lies. I'm not a radical pessimist. I've lived in a lot of these countries, and I sometimes feel that we've managed to achieve a great deal in education and health and infrastructure in countries like Afghanistan. But the only wisdom in these countries is the wisdom of understanding our limits, of what we don't know and what we can't do. The only wisdom is the wisdom of humility. Humility is endless. Thank you very much.
Rory. Just before David takes over, let me ask you, perhaps even on his behalf, since he asked the question, is it then your view that once Western forces had gone in and captured al-Qaeda bases, that we should then have got out?
This is a question about Afghanistan. What I believe about Afghanistan is that what we needed was a light, long-term footprint. That in fact the decision in 2001 to 2002 to keep very few troops, not really get outside Kabul, not really get outside the cities, focus on health, education, infrastructure was the correct one. And that where we actually went wrong is that our fears and our illusions about our own power made us frustrated. We became perfectionists. We began to feel we weren't making as much progress as we wanted. We began to bring in more troops. So if you take Helmand, we went from 300 to 3,000 to 5,000 to 7,000 to 9,000 to 32,000 international troops in a place which has 3% of the landmass and 1% of the population of that country. And it's in that, it's in our inability to understand our limits that the Afghan intervention went wrong. Thank you.
Okay, David.
Rory said that it was precisely the Chicago speech, well, it wasn't precisely, but it was the Chicago speech, had embedded within it the instincts that led to the invasion of Iraq. Actually, I don't think it did. I think that Chicago, as impacted upon by 9/11, might have held within it the seeds of what happened in Iraq. But Iraq was a very particular response to the situation that both America and Britain and some others thought that the countries faced in the wake of 9/11 and the realization that there were groups of terrorists who were prepared to use means that no other group, organization of guerrillas or terrorists had ever been prepared to use. That's essentially what they felt 9/11 told us. Now, to somebody like me, however, intervening in Iraq, although it wasn't something that I wanted for myself, in the sense that it wasn't something that I was advocating before Bush decided to do it, it also was something that I wasn't prepared to oppose exactly because of what was contained in the Chicago speech. To that extent, you are partly right, Rory, and I think you're also partly wrong. But nevertheless, you were in favour of the invasion of Iraq at the time, presumably because you felt that leaving somebody like Saddam in place was a problem. I want to kind of remind ourselves of what the process of policy towards Saddam Hussein actually was between, let's say, 1980 and the time that we invaded in 2003, or let's say between there and 1998. The process in Iraq was this. Firstly, we dealt with Saddam on a friendly basis, on the basis that he was a realpolitik counter to Iran, which we saw as being a threatening regional power. So it was a straightforward calculation of strategic interest which took no account of the internal conditions of the populations either of Iran or of Iraq. It was, in a sense, deeply cynical. It was also, in a way, Rory, deeply in itself prudent and realistic, but it was completely flawed and it had extremely difficult results. Partially as a result of this, Saddam felt emboldened to attack Kuwait, but Kuwait was more of an ally of ours than Iraq was, and this led to the war against Iraq. When that war was finishing, when it was finished, the Shia majority in the south rose up. At this point, we took the prudent case, maybe. We thought more about what we could do than we ought to do, certainly. President Bush did make a statement about how people could rise up, and then we offered no practical help to them doing it in the face of one of the largest armies in the region. The consequence was the suppression, with absolutely massive loss of life, amongst the Shia of southern Iraq, a place which Rory came later to know well. When that was finished, we then set up a series of UN resolutions to deprive Saddam of his capacity, because we had discovered, and we discovered during this process, that he'd had a nuclear program and a weapons of mass destruction program. We also set in place sanctions because, this is through the United Nations, because Saddam refused to comply. We did not enforce his compliance. The sanctions affected the general population of Iraq more than they affected the government of Iraq. And by the time we got to 1998, we were expending a large amount of capital enforcing between the Americans and the British no-fly zones and being the standard bearers for sanctions, which, though they were impacting upon his capacity to attack anybody, were also making us very unpopular around the world and leading to a demand for their withdrawal. In fact, actually, by 2003, we had run out of policy options in Iraq, and almost everything that we had done in the previous 20 years, not in the context of Chicago, helped lead up to the eventual disaster. Funnily enough, despite the catastrophes that attended the intervention in Iraq, the intervention in Iraq itself cannot, I think, at this point, be historically regarded as a catastrophe. Because what you do seem to have in Iraq is a relatively stable government which involves not the highest level of democracy, but some level of democratic involvement and freedoms. It is complicated, as Rory says, these places are, but nevertheless, that is the situation. And what do we face now as a consequence of the way in which people are thinking about, and I'm not going to demur with anything that Rory says about Afghanistan for the moment, because the question always is what happens alternatively, and I do think that Rory also builds, to a certain extent, a fantasy of his alternative imagination of what his Afghanistan looks like, just as I do, to be frank. But I think that we face at the moment a gigantic, and this is obviously the case when looking at things like Libya, a gigantic failure of nerve, partially because of Iraq, partially because of Afghanistan, largely also because of the economic crisis and the crash which has deprived us, in our minds, of the capacity, more or less, to do anything in foreign policy terms. The shift of yes we can to oh God we better not, which I thought was extremely well captured there by Rory. So much so that when the government even went as far as discussing starting the process of looking at a no-fly zone to operate in the case of Colonel Gaddafi using his air force against unarmed or relatively unarmed insurgents, this is what, and I'll finish on this, Simon Tisdall wrote in The Guardian. It's legitimate to ask how far the Prime Minister is prepared to go in backing up his belief that it would be intolerable to allow Gaddafi to use military force against his citizenry. Governments all over the world do exactly that with depressing frequency, whether in Zimbabwe, Uzbekistan, Burma, Iran or China. Britain has somehow learned to live with that without threatening to send in the Marines. You'll notice that David Cameron was not threatening to send in the Marines. This was the reaction to the no-fly zone. And I worry how far this kind of talk leads us to the notion that there is, in effect, nothing we can do, that as James Baker famously said about Bosnia in the early 90s, we have no dog in this fight. Nothing could be more mistaken.